Thank you, guys. You all did great. The text that James read for us is the subject of our study, and it is a text that speaks to us about the purpose of John's gospel. He didn't just willy-nilly say, well, some of the other boys wrote about Jesus, so I guess I'll write what I can remember. His record of the life of Christ, and the miracles in particular, was written with purpose. And tonight's study will be about that purpose. Truly, Jesus did many signs. The signs, that's the miracles. That's one thing we're going to talk about in our study tonight. Nate has done a great job of just summarizing those miracles and showing things in our Christian lives that we can draw comparisons to with those miracles. So I won't spend a lot of time reviewing them because he's already done that for us, but we'll mention them. He speaks of being written in this book and writing a book that others might believe. And so there, John anticipates his record of the miracles that were the subject of his gospel. And then the last thing he says is why he did this. These are written that you might believe and that you might have life because of your belief. John expected to have credibility. John expected people to read what he wrote and think, I think this guy's telling the truth. John is saying these things at the direction of the Spirit. So at the direction of the Spirit, John is thinking about you and about me, reading what he wrote and our hearts being moved and our minds being stirred by these great stories of these great miracles and thinking, this guy has credibility. I think he's telling the truth. And concluding from that I'm going to believe on Jesus. I'm going to believe he is who he claimed to be, and that because of that we would have salvation. That is an optimistic appraisal. And that had to be exciting to John to sit there and think of unreckoned ages yet to come. He didn't know how long it would be that his gospel would be there and that people would read it hungering in their search for truth. He had no idea that the earth would go another 100 years or another 1,000 years, or as it's turned out, 2,000 years. Just some unreckoned period of time. He anticipated people reading and believing him. So let's talk about the miracles. There were multiple miracles, specifically 7 that John talks about. Oh, there were a lot of other miracles, as John says, that are not written in his gospel. Some of them you find in the other gospels. Some of them, the other gospels, just talk about him performing a lot of miracles during a certain window of his ministry, that he went somewhere and healed a lot of people. So it's an unspecified number. So to try to go to the other gospels and count how many miracles they had and add them to John's and get the total, it's kind of tough, because some of the other gospels have some that it just says that a lot happened. It doesn't tell us how many. And John thinks about this and sees this as something he could just write about and write about and write about. But he was writing with a purpose. And he said, this is enough to do the job with the right kind of heart. There is one other miracle that some think of besides these 7 that John recorded, and that would be the miracle of the resurrection. So if you want to count that as a miracle that Christ performed, okay. We won't count it wrong on the test, and there's not going to be a test, so you're good. But Matthew 12, where the Pharisees questioned Christ's miracles, said he was performing a exorcism or casting out devils by the power of the devil, they were seeking for a sign. They said, we want to see a sign from you in Matthew 12 and 38. Jesus answered and said to them, an evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign will be given it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was in the 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. So here Christ used language that counts his miracle of the resurrection, which is what he's talking about here with Jonah, him being crucified and buried and then resurrected 3 days later. He used language that equates that miracle with the other signs that he performed that they did see during his ministry. The odd thing is, the guys that just asked for another sign had already seen signs and said, well, yeah, but he's doing that with the power of the devil. What are they going to do if he does another sign? They've already shown what they're going to do. They're going to believe anything but the obvious because they approach the evidence with an already drawn conclusion. And when you do that, you're doomed. When you do that, you're not searching for truth. You're going with a preconceived idea. Thank you. We know this resurrection is important. Romans 1, Paul talks about it when it says that he is declared to be the Son of God with power, according to the Spirit of holiness, by the resurrection from the dead. What did John say about the record of the miracles that he wrote? He said, I wrote these so you could believe he is who he claimed to be. What did Paul in Romans 1 say about the 8th miracle, if you will, that John records, the miracle of the resurrection? He said it proves he is who he claimed to be, that he's the Son of God. So there's purpose in the record of these miracles. The miracles, you know, were prophesied. Isaiah 35, verse 5 and 6, the eyes of the blind shall be opened, ears of the deaf shall be unstopped, and the lame shall leap like a deer, and the tongue of the dumb sing. For waters shall burst forth in the wilderness, and streams in the desert. I believe this is one, perhaps among other prophecies, that speaks of the Messiah performing miracles. And look at how John records the people of Judea, the Jewish people of the first century, perceiving Christ's miracles. John 7 and 31, many of the people believed in him and said, when Christ comes, will he do more signs than these which this man has done? So the people that watched the miracles that John was recording, and others that he didn't record, they were watching these miracles with an anticipation that the Messiah is going to perform a lot of signs. And as they're looking for that and expecting that, when they see Jesus performing signs, they're drawing the conclusion. So by placing this before us in John 7 and 31, he's enhancing this purpose that he's attached to the record of the ministry of Christ and his miracles in saying, this ought to help you figure out he's the Messiah, because that's what was expected of the Messiah, that he would perform a lot of miracles. Now, John expected people to believe his record. And that's really strong when you write fantastic stories about somebody taking just a little bit of food and feeding a lot of people. I mean, that's a fantastic story. And when you write that and say, you know, people are going to believe this, that's pretty special confidence. But you can look at the credibility of John's record, and you can find credibility in the hostile witnesses. Every existing manuscript of Josephus reports that he spoke of Christ performing miracles. You can read that in Josephus, who was a Jewish historian. Now, I know a lot of people say, well, yeah, but Josephus didn't really say that. I know that. I also know that every existing manuscript of Josephus says, yes, he did. But let's say, okay, he didn't say all that is recorded there about, but at the very least, he spoke of Christ and he spoke of some sense of signs. Whether or not you believe all the conclusions that Josephus inferred from that in the quote where he talks about Christ's miracles, okay, he still mentions the miracles. And if he didn't, later Jewish sources did, and nobody questions these, so why are we arguing about Josephus? This is one thing that befuddles me. The Talmuds and the Mishnah admit that Christ performed miracles, but they dismiss them as magic or sorcery, just like what the Jews did in Matthew 12, which we read from a moment ago. So they didn't question whether or not he did miracles, they just questioned the power that was behind them. Now, these are the hostile witnesses. These are the non-Christians. No wonder John thought people would believe him, because those that were enemies of the faith that he cherished admitted, yeah, he did miracles. And even the pagans admitted it. The Greek magical papery speaks of Jesus as the God of the Hebrews and gives an incantation to cast demons out in his name. This is a pagan source that speaks of Jesus as a miracle worker and as the God of the Jewish people. Another pagan source, Celsus, who is devoutly anti-Christian, admits to Christ having miraculous power he supposedly acquired in Egypt, and by these proclaimed himself a god. So Celsus, a pagan, says Jesus went to Egypt and learned from practitioners of the occult how to perform miracles. So basically what this guy is saying and what the Greek magical paper is insinuating is the same thing the Jews said. Yeah, he did miracles, but it's by the power of the devil or by the power of false gods. And what all of these have in common with John's record is that Jesus performed signs. I think I understand why John expected people to believe him. Because if you take this to a court of law and you have this set of testimony from those who walked with Jesus that say, we saw him perform miracles, and then you've got two opposition camps that are both devoutly against Christianity, and you bring up witnesses from both camps that say, yeah, he did perform miracles, that's a strong legal case. Where the people who walked with him and watched and gave their lives in testimony to the truth of the fact that he performed miracles, and then the two sets of his enemies admitted, yeah, he performed miracles, you've got a strong case that Jesus was a miracle worker. Some people want to know why anybody could look at this much evidence and not believe. And I hear some express great frustration and perplexity. How could you not believe? And the answer is very simple. Because some people approach the evidence the same way those people in Matthew 12 did. The mind is already made up. They watched him do a miracle and said, nope. And then turned right around and had the audacity to say, now do another one. Why? So you can say no again? Let's look at the credibility of the disciples' witness while we're on the subject. John 21 and verse 24, John speaks of himself kind of in third person. This is the disciple who testifies of these things and wrote these things, and we know that this testimony is true. John said, I'm a credible witness. He's not boasting, he's just putting himself forward as a credible witness. When you take it back to a courtroom kind of a way of looking at it, just think of it as somebody taking a stand and looking the judge in the eye and looking the jury in the eye and looking the audience in the eye and affirming, I'm telling the truth. And that's what John is saying here. Speaking perhaps humbly of himself in third person, he's saying, I'm telling the truth when I tell you he turned water into wine. He healed that guy's son. He restored sight to the blind. He did all these things. The number of the complete New Testament manuscripts is more than 5,300. This is some of the evidence that demonstrates the credibility of John's witness as well as that of other writers. You've been through this kind of material before, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, just enough to reacquaint you with it. There are multiple partial copies or fragments and writings outside Scripture that attest to the fact that Christ performed miracles. So there's lots of fragments of the New Testament or portions of translations, early translations of the New Testament that verify, yeah, there was a guy named John, and yes, he said, I saw this happen. But then there are others who write, Some saying, yeah, I knew John. I was his friend. And others talk about other Christians that they knew. And there's stories in all of that of people suffering martyrdom at the insistence that Jesus was a miracle worker. Why would these disciples endure being made outcast, persecuted, or even put to death at the insistence that their claims about Jesus were true? You know, I've seen some deals where people talk about the number of witnesses there are to Christ's miracles and his resurrection and the number of people that saw Bigfoot. You know, and so see, there's many people saw Bigfoot, so see, Christianity is a hoax just like Bigfoot. How many people have died to hold on to their faith that there's a Bigfoot? Those kind of comparisons reveal the intellectual failure and bias of those who make them. They're like the Pharisees of Matthew 12. They stand and look at something marvelous and say, nope, I've already made up my mind. Now let's look at the nature of his record. John 9:16, therefore some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. Others said, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And there was a division among them. Here John says something else regarding his record of the miracles to reveal the bias of his opponents. He reveals what some of the opponents did. They watched Jesus perform miracles. They knew it was miracles, and they said, yeah, but it's Saturday. Really? So the miracle didn't happen? Well, yeah, it happened, but it happened on Saturday. That shouldn't happen. Of course, that gets into a whole discussion of what does or does not constitute violating the Sabbath. And, you know, that's not the assigned scope of our study this evening, but Jesus dealt with that. And he dismissed that for what it was. In Luke 6, I find a fascinating story here in Luke's record, verse 7 through 11. So the scribes and the Pharisees watched him closely, whether he would heal on the Sabbath, that they might find an accusation against him. But he knew their thoughts and said to the man who had a withered hand, arise and stand here. And he arose and stood. Then Jesus said to them, I'll ask you one thing. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or do evil? To save life or destroy? And when he had looked around at them all, he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he did so, and his hand was restored as whole as the other. And they were filled with rage and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. They couldn't answer his argument. He's demonstrating, this doesn't break the Sabbath, and you guys know it. If any of y'all had an animal that was in distress, an ox in the ditch, you'd go pull him out. You don't see that as breaking the Sabbath. Why couldn't I heal someone? And you understand that doesn't break the Sabbath. They couldn't answer that. So they just got mad. But I want you to notice what this story shows us that parallels the theme we're finding in John 9 and verse 16. The enemies of Christ watched him, not just believing that he performed signs, but expecting him to perform signs. Remember when we were young, we had turkeys. I know Mike remembers that because he hated them as bad as I did. There was one thing they did that was really cool. Sometimes hawks can fly so high overhead you don't readily notice them, but turkeys do. We'd go outside if we were tending to the chickens or the turkeys or doing whatever, out doing our chores, because that's all we ever did was work when we were growing up. And you see that old tom turkey, they turn their head sideways because the eyes are on the side of their head. He's got his head turned sideways. I'd get a crick in my net if I did it all the way over like he did. If you saw that tom turkey with his head cocked, there was a hawk overhead. And he was watching him. He was ready to fight. That's one of the reasons the folks had turkeys, was to keep the hawks away from the chicken. The other reason, they knew we hated them, so they wanted to have them. The enemies of Jesus watched him like that turkey watching the hawk. They didn't take their eyes off of him. With what expectation? That he couldn't do anything? That it was put up or shut up and he couldn't prove anything by doing anything miraculous, that they would demonstrate that all of this pretense of signs was just a fraud? No. They watched that closely with an expectation that he would perform signs. So John wrote that down. So we could look at that and say, even the enemies of Jesus believed that he could perform signs. They just wouldn't accept the obvious conclusion of it. And we might look at that and say, well, but, some don't believe John's record. Because they've got the same problems as the ones that John wrote about. Because even the enemies of Jesus that John tells us about admit that Jesus did signs. They just insist on a different conclusion. John wrote with a purpose, that you might believe. I think it's really neat that John recorded so much detail from Jesus' prayer before his crucifixion. In John 17 and 20, Jesus praying said, I do not pray for these alone, meaning the apostles like John, but also for those who will believe in me through their word. So here in John 17 and 20, John was recording the prayer of Jesus as it related to the text of our study tonight. Jesus prayed for those who would take John's gospel record and read it and believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. See that? And so there's some real connective tissue here thematically woven within John's gospel. He's got Jesus praying that for the faith and for the strength and the unity of those people who would do what John anticipated and read John's record and say, I think this old boy's telling the truth. And that accords well with what we learn elsewhere in the New Testament. So faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God. Faith does not happen because God arbitrarily and unjustly selects a few to zap in their hearts faith. Faith comes when someone reads the record with a fair mind, without foredrawn conclusions, and looks at the evidence and evaluates it and believes. John Calvin was wrong. Faith doesn't come because God gave it to this one, but he refuses to give it to this one because he hates them. That's a Calvinist lie. Faith comes to the fair heart that investigates the evidence and draws the obvious conclusion that the enemies of Christ would not. That nobody can do miracles like this unless God be with them, which, Jim, you also find in the book of John. He wrote with the anticipation that people would believe, and that believing you would have life. John 5 and 24, he recorded, most assuredly I say to you, this is Jesus talking, he who hears my word and believes in him who sent me has everlasting life, and shall not come into judgment, but has passed from death unto life. So John said that Jesus said, those that hear and believe his words will have everlasting life. That believing you might have life through his name. What does that encompass? Believing is about more than just changing what you think about Jesus. Believing is something that involves you acting upon that change in thought about Jesus. Romans 6 verse 3 and 4, do you not know that as many as were baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death? Therefore we are buried with him through baptism into death, that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life. Now when Paul here in Romans 6 wrote about having newness of life, he's not writing about a different kind of life that we have when we have life through his name, because we read John's gospel and believed the miracles. He's writing about the same newness of life. He's giving additional information. He's explaining what it means to believe in Jesus. That believing in Jesus isn't just about what you think about Jesus, but it's about what you do about Jesus. And you're not a believer until you do something about what you think about Jesus. When you evaluate the evidence and you conclude and then you act on that conclusion and obey the gospel, then you are a believer. And not until then. And that life that you have through the name of Christ is through this kind of believing. Now let's think about abiding in that belief. 1 John 2 and 24, as best I can understand, the general idea is that 1 John wrote it after he wrote the Gospel of John. That's my understanding. Therefore, let that abide in you which you heard from the beginning. If what you heard from the beginning abides in you, you also will abide in the Son and in the Father. What did they hear in the beginning? They read John's Gospel. And they read about the miracles. And they said, I think John's telling the truth. And so they believed in Jesus and they acted on that faith. And they become followers of Jesus. And now John writes back to them another letter with a refreshed expectation that with this reminder letter, they will continue to believe. That conclusion they drew back when they read his gospel, that they'll stick with that they'll be faithful, that they won't depart. Look at how he put it in 1 John 5 and 13. These things I have written to you who believe in the name of the Son of God, that you may know that you have eternal life and that you may continue to believe in the name of the Son of God. Well, this is getting near the end of that letter. Just like what we're studying tonight is near the end of John's Gospel. And near the end of both letters, John's explaining why he wrote it. And here he says, I wrote it so you'll keep believing. So John wrote the Gospel of John with the thought of producing faith in people. Then later on he wrote 1 John with the idea of advocating that people would continue in that faith. He saw it as further evidence. The testimony of the miracles had already done its work. Now the advocacy of the right way of life would continue to build that faith that his gospel had planted by its seed in the story of the miracles of Jesus. That fascinates me to think of John writing these books in series with that bookend of purposes. And John's getting ready to wrap it up. And he says, I can't write forever. I mean, the world couldn't hold the books, right? He said that. There's a lot of other signs that I'm not writing you folks about. I can't write forever, but I can't stop there. When you read the text we have for our study tonight, it sounds like that's about to be the end of the gospel. But then there's another verse that introduces another chapter. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, and in this way he showed himself. And so from there, John goes on to tell just a little bit more because he just couldn't quite stop talking about Jesus yet. And we have other brethren lined up for future studies to tell us about what else John wrote. I hope your heart is stirred by our consideration of the purpose of John's gospel. I hope that as you read the record of the miracles that you give due thought and credibility to that record and draw the obvious conclusion that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And I hope you're a follower of his tonight. And if you're not, we want to invite you to become one. If you're following Christ but you're struggling to hold on to that faith, remember John later wrote to encourage people to keep on believing, to hang in there. And that's the thought we want to give you. And if we can help you in that with our prayers, we would love to assist you. If we can help you in either way, please come have a seat on the front while we stand and sing.